For the most part, ZBrush is about sculpting the form of an object, not so much about making nice presentable images of it. However, there is a standard plugin that comes with it that makes it a little easier to create presentation renders through Photoshop. So let's see how it works. We'll be using the ZBrush Photoshop plugin, which does a quick and dirty render and sends it off to Photoshop, along with all kinds of other kinds of renders and data that can be layered with different Photoshop effects. You can find that plugin through the Plugins menu and ZBrush Photoshop. Now before we use this, I'm going to set up a couple things. This plugin uses the best preview render. So if we go into the render menu and we come down to BPR render pass and click on BPR, you might get this pop-up. Let me actually deal with this first. Go ahead and click on cancel. Currently it's set to use an external renderer. So let me just move the model here in the viewport to undo that. We'll go to render and let's go to external renderer and make sure keyshot is turned off. Okay, now back to BPR render pass and click BPR. So in ZBrush, what it does is it just does this quick and dirty render. It's not that great of a render, not very good for presentation purposes, but it's what the plugin uses to generate all kinds of different passes that can then be mixed in Photoshop for better effects. Okay, now that we've got keyshot turned off, we can go up to Z plugin. And actually, it doesn't matter if you've rendered through BPR render or not. So it really doesn't matter if it's showing that render or not before we use this plugin. So let's go into Z plugin. And there's lots of different settings we could choose to send to Photoshop. There's all kinds of light passes and mask passes and normal maps and all kinds of things. If you don't know whether or not you're going to need one of these, go ahead and turn it on anyway. You can always choose to turn that layer off in Photoshop afterwards. Okay, let's click Send to Photoshop. So when you click this, it's going to go through and render all these different passes. So you might see some that look kind of silly, or you might not be sure exactly what they're going to be used for, but we'll take a look at all of them in just a moment when it gets into Photoshop. Okay, Photoshop will automatically launch when it's done rendering all those passes.
Now, some people have had a little bug and Photoshop doesn't launch automatically. If that happens, it's most likely an error with your system settings. ZBrush is creating a .jsx file behind the scenes and passing that data to Photoshop. Now, by default, a .jsx file should always open with Photoshop, but sometimes that setting can get altered when updating the software. If that happens, go ahead and create a dummy JSX file on your desktop. So what I would do is right-click on the desktop, go to New, make a text document, and I'll just name this temp. And then I'll change the extension from text to JSX. All right, go ahead and accept this warning. So you can see that the association is with Photoshop for me, but if it's not, you'll want to right-click on it. And you can come down to Open With and pick Photoshop from this list. If it's not in the list, click Choose Another App. You might have to click More Apps. You might have to scroll through this. If Photoshop isn't listed here, click on Look for another app on this PC. Now what you'll get is a window popping up where you can find your installation folder for Photoshop. And then you'll just click on Photoshop.exe and open. With that set, try running Send to Photoshop again. Now you should see the same results as me. Photoshop automatically opened it and brings in all the render passes as separate layers.
Okay, now that that's done, let's take a look through this and see what we've got. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and you can see that we've got these different renders here. These are the different preview and BPR renders out of ZBrush. So you can sort of mix these different renders how you like. So if you like how one of them turns out in one part of the model, but not so much in the other, what you could do is mask it out. So let me demonstrate that right now. So I kind of like how the preview render is looking for the most part, but maybe I like some of the deeper shadows that I'm getting in some areas of the BPR render. So what we can do is make a mask for this one. Let's click on the layer and then click on mask. Now we've got our paintbrush. Let's set this to black. And I'll change my draw size here by holding down Alt and right clicking. And let's just see what happens if we try to paint some of this out. So basically what it's doing is it's masking out part of this layer to let the layer below it show through. So we're getting some of those deeper shadows from this layer. Okay, I'm not going to go too deep into Photoshop stuff because I know this is a ZBrush course, so I'm going to try to keep it pretty simple here. Let's do something else to make the background more of a ocean blue. So let's go ahead and double click on the flat color, and let's change this to something that's a bit more oceany. And let's also get a gradient going. So I'm going to make a new layer. And with a paintbrush, let's get a bigger brush here. I'm just going to Alt right click, get a really nice big one, and we'll get a lighter blue going. Maybe change that flow so it's a nice soft, subtle effect. And I'm just going to paint on some of that color. Okay, something else we can do is mix some of these lights in. So under the lights folder here, you can see we've got these different light passes. Some of them might be a little bit more useful than others. For example, you can see with this light pass, it's creating this kind of garish shadow. So maybe I don't want that one particularly, but maybe this rim light works a little bit better. Let's try some of these others. Kind of a top light there, kind of blows it out a little bit, so I might not use that one so much. Another light with a garish shadow. Another one that's kind of like a rim light. And another light from above. So you can mix these layers however you want. You might want to turn one of them on and decrease its opacity to get a more subtle effect on that. Maybe mix in that rim light, change the opacity on that as well. Okay, let's take a look at a couple other of these layers. One here is Subtool ID. So what this layer is it's a color pass for the various subtools in your scene. So each one gets its own color. Now what's useful about this is it lets you easily mask off different parts of the model. So let's go to our Magic Wand tool. I'm going to hold down here on the Quick Selection tool and get the Magic Wand tool. And we'll just click on the eyeball here. Oops, it looks like I accidentally got the wrong part. Let me turn off some of these shadow passes to make it easier to see these colors. And let's zoom in closer here too. Okay, we'll get that Magic Wand and we'll click in the eye. Now, it looks like my problem is that I needed to have that Subtool ID layer selected. Looks like it should work now. Okay, great. So with just the eye selected, what we could do is now turn off this layer, and we could go make our own new layer. Perhaps under the base layers, we could make a new layer and get the brush out. We'll get a black color here, and we could just paint this a black color. Let's go ahead and make that higher flow. Let's bring the draw size down, and we'll just paint this so that we get more of a dark color for the eye. All right, Control D to deselect, Z to zoom out, holding down Alt so you zoom out. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other things we can do. So I turned off some of these other layers. There's shadow passes that are generated. So if you like that kind of two-tone shadow, that harsher top lit effect, this might be the shadow pass for you. You could change the opacity on this so you get a really intense effect or maybe a very subtle effect. And then there's also an AO pass, ambient occlusion. So this is just a soft, subtle effect where you get a little bit more shadow in crevices and creases and things like that. Okay, there's a ton of things I could do in Photoshop, but since this is a ZBrush course, I'll kind of call it quits for now. It's a good way to work if you're comfortable with Photoshop and you want to do a lot of manual tweaking. If you don't know Photoshop very well and you don't want to manually finesse your render, you might be better off just going through KeyShot.